Before the city wakes, before the ferries begin their slow crossings and the first trains rattle over the bridge to the west, the harbour lies still enough to hold a reflection whole. And in that stillness, just as the light comes up grey and then gold over the water, a shape appears on the point of land called Bennelong, a shape the eye still struggles to believe even after decades of photographs, postcards, and casual familiarity. White shells, curved and layered like something peeled from an enormous shell washed up on a beach, catch the first sun before the buildings behind them do. For a moment, they seem to float, weightless, though anyone who has stood beneath them knows the enormous mass of concrete and tile that holds them to the earth. This is the Sydney Opera House, and it sits where it sits, and looks as it looks, because of a decision made in 1957 by a young Danish architect named Utzon, a decision that would occupy the rest of his working life and very nearly break him entirely. It is worth pausing in this quiet hour before the harbour becomes busy with its ordinary business to consider what was actually asked of the world when this building was still only a drawing. The shape that rises from Bennelong Point today, familiar as it has become, was in its earliest form a sketch with no engineering behind it, no known method of construction, and no confirmed cost. It was, in the plainest terms, an image of what a building might look like, submitted to a competition by a man who had never built anything of comparable scale, drawn in a manner so loose and suggestive that some on the judging panel could not immediately say how such a form could stand at all, let alone how it might be built in concrete, in steel, in the ordinary materials available to builders in the 1950s. The shells, as they would come to be called, existed on paper as a gesture toward an idea, not as a solved geometry. No formula yet existed to describe their curves in a way that a contractor could use to pour concrete or cut tile. That problem, the problem of turning a beautiful drawing into a buildable shape, would consume years of the architect's life and would very nearly consume the building itself before it was ever finished. This is the peculiar nature of the story that unfolds along this harbour shore. It begins, as many great structures do, with an ambition larger than the tools available to answer it. A government wanted a building that could announce a nation to the world. A harbour offered a site that seemed to have been shaped by nature for exactly such a purpose. A low point of land jutting into deep water, visible from every ferry and headland, framed by the bridge that had for decades been the city's only claim to engineering fame. And into this opportunity walked an architect with a sketch that promised something unlike anything built before, a series of shells rising from a platform, catching the light and the water in equal measure, and yet offering, at the moment of its selection, absolutely no proof that it could be built as drawn. The story that follows is not, in the end, a simple story of triumph. It is the story of a competition won on the strength of imagination alone, of a shape without a formula, of a decade spent chasing a geometry that would finally, almost by accident, reveal itself in the curve of a single sphere. It is the story of ground broken before the design was ready, of engineers who spent years testing shapes that could not be built, of a rift that widened slowly between an architect and the government that had once celebrated his name, and of a departure from Australia that the architect himself would never reverse, not once, not even to see his own finished work standing complete against the harbour sky. Utzon left the country part-way through construction and would never return to see the shells finished, never stand beneath the completed roof he had spent the better part of a decade trying to solve. This is the tension at the center of the building that rests today at Bennelong Point. A structure now counted among the most recognizable on Earth, born from an idea that nearly ruined the man who dreamed it. None of this was apparent, of course, in the earliest hours of the project, when the site was still an old tram depot and the drawings were still fresh enough to smell of ink. The building did not begin as a certainty. It began as a gamble, taken by a state premier eager to leave a mark on his city, judged by a panel that included some of the most respected architects of the era, and won by a design that one of those judges, arriving late to the proceedings, pulled back out from a pile of entries already set aside. That single act, a drawing rescued from likely rejection, is where this story properly begins, and it will be told in its place. For now, In this quiet dawn over the harbour, it is enough to hold the outline of what is to come. A competition held in the middle of the 20th century, a design without precedent, a construction that would stretch across not months, but years, doubling and redoubling in cost and complexity, and an architect whose relationship with his own creation would end not in celebration, but in departure, in silence, in a professional and personal rupture that the passage of time has only partly healed. The shells themselves, seen this morning catching the first light, offer no obvious sign of any of this. They simply stand, curved and white, tiled in a pattern that from a distance reads as a single continuous surface and up close reveals itself as thousands of individual ceramic tiles, set in a chevron pattern that plays with the light throughout the day. Ferries cross beneath them without their passengers giving much thought to the strain the design once placed on the engineers tasked with making it real. Tourists photograph the shells without necessarily knowing that for years no one, including the architect himself, could say with certainty how such curves might be built using the concrete technology of the time. The building endures now as something almost inevitable, as though it could only ever have looked this way, could only ever have taken this particular form. But nothing about it was inevitable. Every curve was fought for, calculated, abandoned, and recalculated. Every rib of concrete beneath the tiled surface represents a solution reached only after other solutions failed. And every year of the decade it took to build this structure carried its own cost, not only in money, which multiplied far beyond any early estimate, but in the health, the reputation, and eventually the residency of the man whose name would forever be attached to it. This, then, is the shape of the story that will be told here slowly, in the manner the subject itself seems to demand. A story of a nation wanting to be seen on the world stage, and a design pulled from a stack of rejected entries by a judge who saw something the others had not yet recognized. A story of a shape with no formula and the years spent searching for the geometry that would finally allow it to be built. A story of ground broken before anyone had finished deciding how the building above it would actually stand. A decision that would create difficulties reaching deep into the foundations of the project, both literally and otherwise. A story of a widening rift between an architect and the government funding his ambitions. A rift that would eventually send Utzon away from Australia for the rest of his life, leaving other hands to finish the roof he had first imagined. And finally, a story of what the building became once it was finished, once it opened its doors in October of 1973, and how, across the decades since, it grew from a source of controversy and cost overrun into one of the most beloved structures ever built, a building the world now recognizes instantly, silhouetted against harbour water, regardless of whether the man who first drew it ever saw it complete. Before that longer story unfolds, in its proper order and at its proper pace, it is worth simply sitting with this image a little longer. The harbour at dawn, the shells catching the light before anything else in the city does, white against a sky just beginning to colour. There will be time enough for competitions and controversies, for concrete ribs and engineering breakthroughs, for departures and unfinished endings. For now, let the shells simply stand where they have stood for 50 years, indifferent to the difficulty of their own creation, and let this be an invitation, gentle and unhurried, to settle in for the story of how they came to be, and to consider subscribing if you would like more such stories of the great structures human hands have raised against impossible odds, told slowly, the way this one deserves to be told. To understand why such a building came to be imagined at all, it helps to sit for a while in the Australia of the years just after the Second World War, a country that had sent its young men across oceans to fight in wars begun elsewhere, that had watched its cities remain small and its cultural life modest, while other nations built opera houses and concert halls and grand museums, and that had begun quietly at first and then with growing insistence to ask itself what it might look like if it stopped waiting for permission to be taken seriously. The war had changed something in the national mood. Australians had fought at Gallipoli and in the deserts of North Africa and in the jungles of New Guinea, had watched Singapore fall and had felt, for the first time in living memory, the closeness of real danger to their own shores. And when peace came, it brought with it not only relief, but a kind of restlessness. A sense that the country could no longer simply think of itself as a distant outpost of Britain, content to receive its culture second-hand, its orchestras touring from London, its architecture following patterns laid down in Europe decades before. There was money now, or at least the promise of money, as immigration surged and industry expanded and cities like Sydney grew outward and upward with a haste that outpaced the imagination of the town planners who tried to keep order over it. And there was, alongside all this growth, an unspoken hunger, difficult to name precisely, but easy to feel in the newspapers and the political speeches of the day, for something that would mark Australia as more than a producer of wool and wheat, more than a junior partner in the affairs of the world, something that would announce in a single unmistakable structure, if such a thing could be built, that this was a nation capable of culture as well as commerce, of vision as well as labor. Sydney itself in those years was a harbour city, still finding its shape, its skyline low, its grandest structure still the great steel arch of the harbour bridge, completed some 2 decades earlier and already beloved as a symbol of the city's ambition. But a bridge, however magnificent, was an engineering triumph built for crossing water, not a home for music, and Sydney had no true opera house, no concert hall worthy of the name, no single building where the Sydney Symphony Orchestra might perform with dignity, where opera companies might stage productions without borrowing the improvised acoustics of town halls and exhibition buildings never designed for such purposes. The site that would eventually hold the answer to this absence was at the time occupied by something far less inspiring than any opera house, a collection of aging tram sheds at Bennelong Point, a spit of land jutting into Sydney Harbour near the eastern edge of the central business district, a place that had once held a fort and later a tram depot, its sheds by the 1940s grown shabby and increasingly obsolete as the city's tram network itself began to be phased out in favour of buses. The point had, in earlier centuries, carried the name of Bennelong, a man of the Eora people who had served as an intermediary between the first British colonists and the Aboriginal population of the region, and the land held that older history quietly beneath its more recent industrial use, a fact that would return, gently and without much fanfare, into public memory only much later, as the building that eventually rose there came to be understood as sitting upon ground with a much longer story than any tram shed could suggest. It was into this landscape, both physical and cultural, that a modest ambition first took root. The idea, at first almost incidental, that the tram sheds might be cleared away and something better put in their place, something that could serve as a home for the performing arts that the growing city so plainly lacked. The person most responsible for turning this modest ambition into an actual undertaking was Joseph Cahill, the Premier of New South Wales, a man whose background gave little obvious hint that he would become remembered, in part, as the political force behind one of the most extraordinary buildings of the 20th century. Cahill had grown up in modest circumstances, had worked as a railway fettler before entering politics, had risen through the ranks of the Labour Party with the kind of steady, unglamorous persistence that marked so many careers of his generation, and by the time he became Premier in 1952, he was, by most accounts, a practical man more given to infrastructure and public works than to grand cultural gestures. Yet something in the idea of an opera house at Bennelong Point seems to have caught hold of him, whether through genuine passion for music, which some accounts suggest he possessed in quiet, private ways, or through a sharper political instinct that recognized what such a building might do for the standing of Sydney and of his own government, or, as is often the case with such decisions, through some blend of both motives that no single account can fully untangle. Whatever combination of reasons drove him, Cahill pushed the proposal forward with a persistence that outlasted considerable skepticism, including skepticism from within his own party, where some questioned the wisdom of committing public funds to a cultural building when housing and roads and hospitals seemed to many the more urgent priorities of a growing state. The decision that would prove most consequential, and the one that set the entire story in motion toward its now famous shape, was Cahill's choice to hold an international design competition rather than commissioning a local architect directly or adopting a more conventional design through ordinary government channels. This decision, announced and formalized in 1955, was itself a kind of statement, a signal that Australia intended to look outward, to invite the participation of architects from anywhere in the world, and to judge the resulting proposals not by local custom or convenience, but by international standards of ambition and originality. The competition brief that emerged asked for a building that would house both a large hall suitable for orchestral concerts and grand opera, and a smaller hall for chamber music and more intimate performances, along with the necessary supporting spaces, and it invited submissions from architects across the globe, offering a substantial prize to the winning design and the promise, at least in principle, that the winning design would actually be built. This was, in its own quiet way, an act of considerable boldness for a country that had never before attempted anything of this scale in the realm of cultural architecture, a gamble that assumed international architects would take the competition seriously, that a worthy design would emerge from the process, and that the government and the public of New South Wales would ultimately be willing to pay whatever cost such a building might demand. It is worth pausing here to consider the state of Australian architecture and engineering in this period, because the contrast between what existed locally and what the competition seemed to be asking for was considerable. Australian architecture through the middle of the 20th century had produced solid, capable work, competent civic buildings, sturdy commercial structures, houses adapted sensibly to the Australian climate and landscape, but it had not, by most accounts of architectural historians who have studied the period, produced anything that could be called internationally pioneering, anything that placed the country at the forefront of architectural thought in the way that certain American, European, or Scandinavian practices were beginning to do in those same years. Australian engineering, meanwhile, had considerable strengths, as the Harbour Bridge itself demonstrated, strengths built on solid training and a willingness to undertake large infrastructure projects, but it too remained somewhat provincial in outlook, more comfortable with proven methods than with untested innovation. There was, among many Australian architects and engineers of the period, a restlessness about this state of affairs, a sense that the country's technical capabilities had matured to a point where they might be equal to greater ambitions if only the opportunity and the will to pursue them could be found. The Opera House competition then arrived at a moment when this restlessness was ready to be tested, when a generation of Australian professionals watched to see whether their country, given the chance, might produce or attract something genuinely remarkable, or whether the result would simply confirm the provincial reputation that many quietly feared was deserved. The stakes of the competition, though rarely stated so plainly in the documents and speeches of the time, were in fact considerable, extending well beyond the practical question of where the Sydney Symphony Orchestra might perform. What was being asked, in effect, was whether Australia could produce or draw to itself a building capable of standing among the great cultural monuments of the world, a building that might do for Sydney what the Eiffel Tower had done for Paris, or what certain grand halls had done for Vienna or London, something that would fix the city and the nation in the international imagination as a place of serious cultural achievement rather than merely economic promise. It was, in the quiet language of ambition that so often accompanies such undertakings, a chance for a young nation to be seen, not simply as a supplier of raw materials to older empires, but as a place capable of vision, of daring, of culture equal to its confidence in its own future. Few among those who launched the competition in 1955 could have imagined just how literally that ambition would be tested, nor how strange and difficult the path toward its fulfillment would prove to be, nor that the very drawings which would eventually answer this hunger for recognition would, at first, come startlingly close to being discarded entirely, cast aside among a stack of entries judged unworthy of a second look. The judging took place across many quiet weeks, in rooms where light fell evenly across long tables, and where the entries, some 233 of them arriving from 32 countries, were laid out for consideration by a panel of 4 men entrusted with choosing the design that would come to represent in physical form the aspirations of an entire nation. 3 of the judges had been present from the earliest sessions, working steadily through the submissions with the patience the task demanded, sorting the possible from the impossible, the practical from the merely hopeful. By the time the 4th judge arrived, delayed by travel from the other side of the world, the panel had already narrowed its selections down to a shortlist and had, in the ordinary course of such things, set aside a larger pile of entries deemed not to merit further discussion. It was into this discarded pile that Eero Saarinen, the Finnish-American architect known for his own explorations of curved and sweeping form, chose to look not from any formal obligation, but from a quiet instinct that something worth seeing might yet remain among the rejected. What he found there, according to the accounts that survive, was a set of drawings unlike anything the other judges had paused over. They were not, by the conventional standards of architectural competition, complete. They lacked the precise sectional detail, the engineering notation, the careful proof of feasibility that many of the other 200 or so entries had taken pains to display. What they offered instead was a gesture, a series of shell-like forms rising from a long platform, suggesting less a fixed building than a moment caught in motion, as though the structure itself might be sails caught by wind, or shells left by a retreating tide, or the white wings of some enormous seabird settling over the harbor's edge. The drawings were sparse, almost tentative in their rendering, yet they held an idea that none of the other entries seemed to carry. The sense that a building could rise from its site not as an object imposed upon the land, but as something that belonged there, an extension of the water and the light rather than an interruption of it. Saarinen returned to the panel with these drawings in hand, and by his advocacy, according to the record left by those present, the entry was pulled back from among the discarded and placed once more before serious consideration. It is worth pausing here, gently, on how close this moment came to never happening at all. How a single hour of oversight, a single afternoon in which no one thought to look again at the rejected stack, might have left the harbour unchanged, the design unseen, the name attached to it unknown to history. The sources do not record precisely what words passed between Saarinen and his fellow judges in the hours that followed, only that discussion continued, and that a decision was eventually reached to award the design first prize, despite its incompleteness, on the strength of what one of the judges would later describe as an idea so bold and simple that it could become one of the great buildings of the world. The hand behind the drawings belonged to Utzon, a Danish architect then in his mid-30s, working from an office in Denmark, a country whose architectural traditions ran deep and quiet, marked by careful proportion, honest materials, and a long-standing respect for craftsmanship passed down through generations. Utzon had trained under Danish masters who valued restraint and clarity, yet he had also travelled widely, drawing inspiration from places far removed from the temperate light of Scandinavia. He had studied, with particular attention, the ancient platforms of the Maya, structures raised across the jungles of Mesoamerica centuries before, where temples sat atop broad terraced bases that lifted them above the surrounding canopy, creating a plane from which the sacred structure could rise toward the sky. In these platforms, Utzon found something that resonated deeply with his own instincts about architecture. The idea that a great building did not need to dominate its landscape through height alone, but could instead establish a horizontal foundation, a base of ceremony and arrival, from which the vertical elements might then rise with greater meaning and clarity. He had also studied with equal care the forms found in nature, the curve of a wave as it broke and receded, the geometry of clouds gathering before a storm, the structure of a shell, the way organic forms so often achieved their strength not through rigid uniformity, but through a kind of controlled irregularity, each curve responding to forces of growth and pressure in ways that no drafting table could easily replicate. This admiration for organic form, for the architecture that nature itself produced through patient accumulation rather than sudden design, would come to define much of what Utzon attempted in his sketches for the Sydney Opera House, though at the time of the competition, the full implications of what he had drawn remained far from resolved, even in his own understanding. The announcement came in January of 1957, delivered to a public that had, for the most part, been only distantly aware of the competition's progress, and to a small community of architects and engineers who received the news with a far more complicated reaction. The name Utzon meant little to most people outside of Scandinavian architectural circles at the time, and the design itself, when published in newspapers and professional journals, drew immediate and audible murmurs of doubt. Engineers who examined the drawings, according to accounts from the period, found themselves troubled by what they could not find within them. There were no calculations demonstrating how the great curved shells might bear their own weight, no clear structural system explaining how such forms could be built using the concrete and steel technologies available at the time. No indication, beyond the poetic suggestion of the drawings themselves, of how the vision might be translated into something that could stand upright against wind, gravity, and time. It must be said gently, and without diminishing what Utzon had achieved, that the design selected in January of 1957 was, in the truest sense, an idea rather than a building. It was a poetic gesture toward what a building might become, expressed through the confident sweep of a few lines on paper, rather than a buildable structure with a proven method of construction behind it. This distinction, though it may seem a small one, would come to matter enormously in the years that followed, as the gap between the beauty of the sketch and the reality of engineering it into permanence proved far wider and far more difficult to close than anyone, judges, architect, or government, could have anticipated in that January of celebration and doubt. Among those who studied the drawings in the weeks after the announcement were structural engineers who had built their careers on more conventional geometries, domes, arches, rectilinear frames whose behavior under load could be calculated with established formulas refined over decades of use. The shells that Utzon proposed followed no such established mathematics. They were not portions of a single sphere, nor sections of a simple parabola, nor any other shape for which existing structural theory offered a ready answer. They were, as drawn, essentially free forms, their curves determined by aesthetic instinct rather than by any known equation, and this absence of a governing geometry troubled the engineering community from the very first days of public discussion. Some engineers went so far as to suggest, quietly and then less quietly, that the design as submitted could simply not be built using the technology and materials of the 1950s, that the shells, if constructed as drawn, would either collapse under their own weight or would require such enormous quantities of reinforced concrete that the cost and complexity would render the project impossible to complete within any reasonable budget or timeline. The government of New South Wales, having awarded the prize and announced the winner with considerable public fanfare, now found itself in the position of having committed, at least in principle, to constructing a building that no one, not the judges, not the architect, not the engineers who would soon be consulted, yet knew how to build. This uneasy truth, that a magnificent idea had been chosen before its feasibility had been established, would hang over the project for years to come, shaping every difficulty that followed, from the earliest excavations to the long, painful search for a structural solution that could translate Utzon's vision into something the laws of physics would actually allow to stand. Yet, in that January moment, amid the murmur of professional doubt, there was also, among those who had seen the drawings and felt something stir in response to their strange and unresolved beauty, a quiet conviction that the difficulty, however great, would prove worth enduring. A conviction that would be tested more severely and for far longer than anyone could have foreseen. The firm that would carry the weight of that conviction was Arup and Partners, a London-based engineering practice already respected for its willingness to work at the edge of what concrete and steel could be persuaded to do. Arup himself, Danish by birth and trained in both mathematics and structural engineering, had built a reputation on a particular kind of patience, the sort that could sit with a problem for months without forcing a premature answer. It was this quality, more than any specific technical precedent, that made his firm the natural choice to attempt what Jörn Utzon's competition drawings had only gestured toward. The sails, as they were already being called informally within the profession, existed on paper as a series of freehand curves drawn with the confidence of an artist rather than the precision of an engineer. They suggested shells that billowed and overlapped like canvas caught in wind, each one different from the next, none of them reducible to any standard geometric form that concrete could be poured or steel could be bent to follow. When Arup's engineers examined the drawings closely in the months after the competition result was announced, their alarm was quiet, professional, and entirely genuine. A curve drawn by hand, however beautiful, was not a curve that could be built. Somewhere beneath the sketch there needed to be a mathematical description precise enough to guide formwork, calculate loads, and predict how the immense concrete surfaces would behave under wind, under their own weight, and under the shifting temperatures of a harbor city. No such description yet existed. The task before the engineers, then, was not simply to support a design, but to discover, after the fact, a geometry that the architect had drawn from feeling rather than formula. The years that followed, from 1957 into the early 1960s, became a prolonged and largely invisible campaign to find that geometry. It was a search conducted mostly in drafting rooms and workshops, far from public view, in which the ambition of the building and the limits of available mathematics were made to confront one another again and again. The early attempts assumed that each shell might be treated as its own unique structure, an approach that seemed to honor Utzon's original vision most faithfully, but which multiplied the engineering difficulty many times over. Every differently curved surface required its own analysis, its own formwork, its own calculation of stress and movement, and with dozens of shells envisioned across the building's roofline, the arithmetic of the problem grew forbidding almost as soon as it was attempted. Engineers built physical models in an effort to see what could not yet be calculated, shaping plaster and timber into approximations of the drawn curves, hoping that a physical object might yield insights that equations so far could not. Model after model was built, examined, and set aside. Some proved impossible to reconcile with the loads a roof of that height and span would actually bear. Others were mathematically tidy but visually foreign to the spirit of Utzon's original sketches, flattening the dynamic energy of the sails into something more conventional and, in the eyes of those overseeing the project, less worthy of what had won the competition in the first place. Each failure was recorded, filed, and left behind, not out of carelessness, but because there was, at that stage, nothing else to do with an unworkable idea except set it down and begin again. It would be a mistake to imagine this period as one of dramatic confrontation, of raised voices in drafting rooms or engineers pounding tables in frustration. The accounts that survive from those inside Arup's team describe something closer to a long, unglamorous siege, patient, procedural, and largely free of the kind of incident that makes for vivid anecdote. Engineers arrived at their desks each morning to resume calculations left unfinished the evening before. Drafts were revised, checked against emerging structural models, and revised again. There was no single dramatic breakthrough being withheld and delayed. There was only the accumulating weight of curves that refused, one after another, to resolve into anything sound enough to build. The war, if it can be called that, was fought not against a visible enemy, but against the abstract intransigence of a shape that had no formula, a form that existed successfully as an image, as a felt impression of sails and shells, but which resisted every attempt to translate it into the specific language of stress, span, and support that construction required. Arup's own temperament suited this kind of struggle. He was known among colleagues for a willingness to admit that a problem remained unsolved, rather than to force a solution merely to satisfy a schedule. And it was this trait, more than any flash of engineering brilliance, that allowed the search to continue as long as it needed to, without collapsing into premature compromise. The team's patience was not passive. It was an active, disciplined refusal to accept an answer that only appeared to work. Yet patience of this kind exists uneasily alongside the demands of government and public expectation. And it was during these same years that the political pressure surrounding the Opera House began to intensify in ways that would shape, and in some respects distort, the entire project. The New South Wales government under Premier Joseph Cahill had championed the Opera House as a signature achievement, a marker of the state's ambition and of Sydney's arrival as a city capable of housing culture on a scale to rival older and more established capitals. Cahill's administration had staked considerable political capital on the project moving forward visibly and swiftly, and there was an evident desire, understandable in the context of electoral cycles and public patience, to see construction begin long before the engineering problems at the heart of the design had actually been resolved. This created a peculiar and difficult tension that would come to define much of the Opera House's early history. The roof, the very element that gave the building its identity and its claim to genius, remained undesigned in any buildable sense, even as pressure mounted to break ground and demonstrate visible progress on the site itself. It was not lost on those closest to the technical work that beginning construction before the shells had been resolved carried real risk, that decisions made in haste on the lower levels of the building might later prove incompatible with whatever structural solution the roof eventually required. But the political calculus operated on a different timeline than the engineering one, and the accounts from this period suggest a growing, quietly voiced concern among the technical teams that the sequence of events being urged upon them was, in engineering terms, precisely backward. This tension was not the product of malice or incompetence on either side. The politicians pressing for visible progress were responding to entirely legitimate pressures of their own, the need to justify public expenditure and sustain confidence in a project whose costs were already the subject of scrutiny. The engineers and the architect, meanwhile, were confronting a problem that simply could not be rushed without courting failure on a scale that would dwarf any embarrassment caused by delay. Utzon himself, informed regularly of the difficulties Arup's team faced, maintained through this period a stance that combined genuine collaborative openness with an unwillingness to abandon the essential character of his design merely to arrive at an easier answer. He continued to believe, according to those who worked alongside him, that a coherent geometric solution existed somewhere within the family of curves he had drawn, even if neither he nor the engineers had yet found the mathematical key that would unlock it. This belief, whether justified by the eventual outcome or not, sustained the search through years in which a less committed architect or a less patient engineering firm might have settled for a compromised, structurally convenient roof that abandoned the sails altogether in favor of something more conventional and more easily built. By the early 1960s, then, the situation surrounding the Sydney Opera House had settled into an uneasy equilibrium that could not hold indefinitely. On one side stood a design of extraordinary and still unrealized ambition, its defining feature reduced to plaster models and abandoned geometries, no closer to a buildable form than it had been when the competition drawings were first unrolled. On the other stood a government eager, for reasons both political and genuinely civic, to see the site transformed from an empty promise into visible progress, foundations poured, columns rising, something the public could look upon and understand as forward motion. Between these two pressures, the engineers of Arup and partners continued their quiet work, testing curve after curve, model after model, in search of the one mathematical relationship that might finally allow Utzon's sails to stand. They had not yet found it. But in the patient, procedural persistence of that search, unglamorous, unresolved, and largely unseen by the public whose enthusiasm and impatience shaped the political weather around it, lay the seed of the solution that would eventually arrive, unannounced and almost accidental in its discovery, from a source no one on the project had expected to provide it. In March of 1959, before that mathematical relationship had been found, before the engineers of Arup and partners had settled on any single method by which the shells might rise and hold their shape against wind and their own considerable weight, construction began. The decision to break ground at that moment was not, in any meaningful sense, an engineering decision. It was a political one, made in the offices of a state government facing an election, made by men who understood that a hole in the earth and a foundation stone laid were more persuasive to a restless public than any number of drawings, however elegant, sitting unrealized in a drafting office. A structure half imagined on paper could be cancelled. A structure with concrete already poured into the ground was, in the calculus of politics, if not of engineering, a structure already underway, and therefore a structure far harder to abandon. The Premier of New South Wales at the time, Joseph Cahill, had championed the Opera House from its earliest public stirrings, had lent his office and his considerable political capital to the competition that found Utzon's design among the hundreds submitted, and had watched with evident satisfaction as public sentiment gathered around the promise of the building on Bennelong Point. But sentiment, as anyone in public office comes to learn, is a fragile weather system, prone to shifting with a change in season or a change in ministry. Cahill wished the project to be irreversible before any such shift could occur. He is recorded as having pressed for work to begin as early as possible, and those around him have since suggested in interviews and memoirs written long after the fact that he understood perfectly well the design was incomplete, that the shells existed at that point as a compelling geometry rather than a resolved structure, that Utzon and the engineers were still searching for the mathematics that would let the roof stand at all. He is said to have judged, correctly as it turned out in the narrowest sense, that beginning construction would make cancellation politically impossible, whatever technical difficulties still lay ahead. It is worth pausing on this quietly, without excessive judgment, because the consequences of that early start would not announce themselves for years. They did not arrive as a single dramatic failure. They arrived instead as a slow accumulation of friction. Friction between a design still evolving and a structure already rising to meet it. Friction between an architect who wished to solve each problem with full and patient rigor, and a government that had already committed public funds and public attention to a firm date and a firm image. The seed planted in March of 1959 was not visible at the time. It would not become visible for the better part of a decade. But it was there from the first shovel of earth turned on the point, in the simple and unresolved tension between speed and readiness, between the pressure to be seen building and the deeper, slower work of knowing exactly what was being built. Bennelong Point itself was, at the time work began, a low promontory jutting into Sydney Harbour, a place that had served for generations as the site of a tram depot, its edges shaped by decades of reclamation and modest industrial use rather than by any particular grandeur. The ground beneath it was a mixture of natural sandstone, the same warm-toned rock that underlies much of the harbour's edge, overlaid in places by fill and made ground, accumulated through years of use and adjustment. Surveys conducted ahead of construction found the bedrock to be reasonably sound in places, uneven and requiring deeper excavation in others, and it was into this ground that the first true work of the Opera House began. Not the shells, which existed still only as sketches and provisional models, but the podium, the great platform of concrete and stone upon which the whole building would eventually stand. The podium was, in a sense, the safest place to begin. Its purpose, to provide a broad, level, elevated base housing the theatres, foyers and service spaces beneath the shells above, was reasonably well understood even while the shells themselves remained unresolved. Columns were designed to carry loads, foundations were sunk to bear weight, and work proceeded through the winter and spring of 1959 and into the following year with a steady, workmanlike rhythm. Piling rigs stood along the point, driving deep into the ground to reach solid bearing, and the harbour air carried the sound of their work out across the water at all hours, a low mechanical pulse that residents on the northern shore recalled decades later as the first audible sign that something significant was underway on the point. The workers who arrived each morning came from across Sydney and, in a good number of cases, from further afield still. Migrants from Britain, from Italy, from Yugoslavia and Greece, drawn to Australia in the post-war years by the promise of work and by assisted passage schemes that had reshaped the demographics of the city's labour force. They gathered at the site gates before dawn, collected their tools, and moved down into the excavation in small practiced groups, men whose trades, concreting, steel fixing, carpentry, surveying, had been learned on other sites, other buildings, and were now being applied to a project unlike anything most of them had encountered. The surveyors in particular faced an unusual burden even in these early stages, for the point's irregular shoreline and its uneven underlying rock required constant careful measurement to ensure that the podium's levels and alignments would be true. True not only to the drawings as they existed, but true in some anticipatory sense to whatever might yet come to sit above them, a set of shells whose precise geometry, weight distribution, and points of contact with the podium below remained, as the surveyors worked, still substantially undetermined. There is something worth sitting with in that condition, a condition rarely encountered in the long history of building. Ordinarily, a foundation is laid in direct response to the structure it will carry. Its dimensions, its loads, its points of stress calculated in advance so the ground beneath can be shaped precisely to receive them. At Benelong Point, in 1959, and through much of 1960, that ordinary relationship was reversed, or perhaps more accurately suspended. The podium rose level by level, its columns set at intervals derived from Utzon's early architectural plans, while above it, in the drafting rooms of Utzon's practice and the offices of Arup and partners, the shells that would eventually rest upon those columns remained a matter of active, unresolved investigation. No one could yet say with engineering certainty precisely how the loads of the finished roof would be transmitted downward into the very foundations being poured. The engineers proceeded on informed estimates, on the best available understanding of the shells as originally conceived, building in margins of tolerance and adjustment where they could, but the fundamental oddity of the sequence remained. A base was being built in exacting and costly concrete and stone for a roof that did not yet exist in any final engineering sense at all. Peter Hall, then a young architect unconnected to the project, would later describe the situation with a kind of professional astonishment, noting that in the ordinary course of building practice, such a sequence would be considered close to reckless, that no engineer would normally countenance pouring permanent foundations before the loads they were meant to bear had been calculated with confidence. Yet reckless is perhaps too strong and too modern a word for what was, in its own context, a calculated political gamble dressed in the practical clothing of construction. Ove Arup himself, whose firm bore the considerable technical burden of eventually reconciling the podium already built with the shells still being solved, is recorded as having accepted the situation with the weary pragmatism of an engineer who understood that the decision had been made above his level of authority, and that his task now was simply to make the best of ground already broken. Through those early months, the site took on the particular sensory character that would mark it for years afterward. The smell of wet concrete curing in the harbour air, the rhythmic clang of formwork being assembled and struck, the calls of foremen carrying across the point, the gulls wheeling overhead indifferent to the human ambitions unfolding beneath them, and always, somewhere beyond the noise of the work itself, the water of the harbour moving quietly against the point's edge, patient in a way the project itself, driven by electoral timetables and public expectation, was not permitted to be. Ferries passed close by on their regular routes, their passengers glancing curiously at the rising platform, at the cranes standing against the sky, at a construction site that from a distance appeared straightforward, piles, columns, a broadening deck of concrete, but which concealed within its schedule and its sequencing a problem that had, as yet, no solution. By the time the podium neared completion in its early stages, the gap between what had been built and what remained unresolved above it had become, to those close to the project, an increasingly evident concern. The government had its groundbreaking, its visible proof of commitment, its photographs of ministers standing on freshly poured concrete. The public had its early glimpse of a shape beginning to take form on the point where the tram sheds had once stood. But the engineers, still testing curve after curve in search of the geometry that would let the shells stand, understood with a clarity not yet shared by the wider public that the foundations rising steadily beneath the Sydney sky were foundations for a building not yet, in the truest sense, designed. For nearly 2 years, the search for the shape of the shells had gone on in this manner, quietly, without resolution, in offices in London and Sydney where drawings were made and unmade and made again. Ove Arup and his partners had tried parabolas, they had tried ellipsoids, they had tried freehand curves lifted directly from Utzon's early sketches and then subjected to the cold arithmetic of stress and load, and each attempt had failed in its own particular way, sometimes gracefully, sometimes not, but always failed. A shell that curved beautifully on paper might, when tested against the mathematics of wind and weight, prove to be a shape that could not be built twice the same way, and a building of such singular ambition could not be raised shell by unrepeatable shell, each one its own unprecedented problem in formwork and calculation. The cost of that alone, quite apart from the question of whether such shapes could stand at all, threatened to make the building impossible in the most practical of senses, the sense measured in money and years rather than in vision. It was in this long season of trial that Utzon began to turn his attention away from the shells as independent sculptural forms and toward a question that was, in its way, more fundamental. He began to ask not what shape each shell should be, considered on its own, but what relationship might exist between all of them, considered together. If the shells could not each be their own unrepeatable miracle of engineering, then perhaps they might instead be understood as variations upon a single deeper form, a form that could be expressed mathematically and therefore repeated and therefore built. The accounts that survive from those close to Utzon in this period and his own later recollections describe the breakthrough arriving not as a sudden vision but as a slow clarification. The kind of realization that seems, in hindsight, to have been inevitable, though it had eluded so many careful minds for so long. He was, by his own account, working with the model of a sphere, perhaps turning it in his hands or watching light fall across its surface, and he saw that if a sphere of sufficient size were cut through with a series of planes, the sections lifted from its surface would each carry the same curvature, the same underlying geometry, however different their outlines might appear once trimmed to different heights and widths. A slice taken near the crown of the sphere and a slice taken lower down, given different edges, given different silhouettes to suit the varying shells the building required, would nonetheless share a single radius, a single mathematical parent. The shells, in other words, need not each be a bespoke miracle. They could all be members of the same family, born from the same sphere, distinguished from one another only by where upon that sphere's surface they had been cut. It is difficult from this distance to convey how quietly enormous this realization was, because its elegance disguises its consequence. The idea itself can be stated simply enough, so simply that it can sound almost modest, almost obvious once spoken aloud, and perhaps this is why so many later tellings of the opera house's story pass over it briskly, eager to reach the drama of what followed. But the simplicity was the achievement. Utzon had not found a clever trick to make one difficult shape possible. He had found a way to make an entire family of complex, soaring, individually distinct forms, all reducible to variations on a single sphere, a single radius, a single constant that could be written down, checked, and trusted. Where before every curve in the design had threatened to become its own unrepeatable act of faith, now every curve could be understood as a controlled departure from one shared geometric truth. The shift this created in the offices of Arup and Partners was not immediate, because such a claim required rigorous testing before anyone would allow it to reshape the ongoing calculations of a building already under construction. But when the testing came, it came as confirmation rather than contradiction. Arup's engineers took the notion of a single sphere and began to work through what it would mean for load, for rib placement, for the distribution of weight across each shell's surface, and they found that the mathematics, so long resistant to every other proposed shape, now yielded to analysis with something approaching cooperation. A spherical section behaves under stress in ways that can be calculated with confidence, because a sphere is among the most thoroughly understood forms in the whole of geometry, its properties known and reliable long before anyone thought to raise concrete shells above a harbor. What had defeated the engineers before was not a failure of their skill, but the simple fact that freehand, individually sculpted curves resist the kind of clean calculation that spherical geometry welcomes. Now, with every shell reducible to an arc drawn from the same great circle, the loads could be traced, the ribs could be positioned with confidence, and the whole troubled question of how such forms might stand without collapsing under their own daring began at last to answer itself. There was, beyond the relief of calculation, a practical gift buried inside the discovery that mattered just as much to the builders as to the mathematicians. Because every shell segment now derived from the same sphere, every precast concrete rib required to build those shells could be cast from the same mold, repeated as many times as necessary, adjusted only in length or angle rather than reinvented in shape. This was not a small mercy. A construction site that had faced the prospect of manufacturing endless one-off components, each demanding its own formwork, its own testing, its own long delay, while workers and engineers confirmed that this particular curve would hold, now faced instead the more governable task of producing a family of related parts from a shared template, varying the cut, but never the underlying curve. The ribs could be precast on site, in a specially built facility raised for exactly this purpose, and lifted into place with a confidence born not of hope, but of repetition, each piece a known quantity rather than a fresh gamble. What had seemed only months before to be an unbuildable dream had become, through this single insight, something closer to an industrial process, still demanding immense skill and care, but no longer demanding a miracle for every shell. It is worth pausing on how strange and how quietly satisfying this resolution truly was, because the sphere is among the oldest and most familiar shapes known to builders, present in domes and vaults stretching back through centuries of construction long before anyone imagined shells rising like sails above a harbor. Utzon had not needed some entirely new mathematics unknown to history in order to solve his problem. He had needed only to see that the answer to an apparently unprecedented shape lay inside one of the oldest and most ordinary forms available to any builder or mason, a form whose behavior under load had been understood in one fashion or another since the earliest domed roofs were raised over grain stores and temples. The revolutionary and the ancient met inside the same solution, and something about that meeting feels, even now, less like a technical fix and more like a kind of poetic justice, as though the building had been searching all along not for a new kind of geometry but for the oldest one, seen freshly. The effect of this discovery upon the mood of the project, both in the design offices and on the site itself, is recorded by those present as something close to a release of held breath. The years leading up to this point had been marked by a particular kind of quiet strain. The strain of working toward a building whose final form remained, in its precise mathematical sense, unresolved. A strain felt by engineers who could not yet say with certainty that the shape before them would stand, and felt too by workers pouring foundations for a building whose upper structure existed still only as ambition. With the sphere established as the shell's common origin, the calculations that followed did not become effortless, because immense labor remained in working out the exact radius required, the exact points at which the sphere should be sliced to produce each shell's particular height and width and lean, and immense further labor remained in translating those calculations into the specific ribs and segments that workers would actually cast and lift. But the character of the labor had changed. It was no longer labor spent searching in the dark for a shape that might not exist. It was labor spent refining a shape now known to exist, now proven capable of standing, now reducible to numbers that could be checked and trusted and built upon with growing confidence. There is a certain quiet wonder in imagining the moment this news passed from the design offices to the site, however gradually and undramatically that passing likely occurred, because it marks the point at which a building that had existed as ambition, as sketch, as argument, as unresolved anxiety, began finally to become a building that could be constructed according to a known and repeatable method. The sphere, that most ancient and unassuming of forms, had quietly resolved what years of more exotic invention had failed to resolve, and in doing so, it gave the shells of the Sydney Opera House their true beginning, not as sculpture alone, but as sculpture made buildable, sculpture reconciled at last with the patient, exacting mathematics that gravity has always demanded of anyone who dares to build toward the sky. With the geometry finally settled, the work that followed was not the work of visionaries, but of makers, and it was in this quieter labor that the true character of the building began to reveal itself. Once every shell could be understood as a slice cut from the surface of a single imagined sphere, the engineers and builders could begin the long process of turning that abstraction into something that could be lifted, set, and joined by human hands. The method they arrived at was precast concrete ribbing, a system in which each shell would be assembled not as a single poured mass, but as a sequence of individual rib segments, cast separately in a controlled yard, then transported, lifted, and fitted together on site like the vertebrae of some vast concrete spine. It was a method born of necessity as much as elegance, for no formwork of the era could have held wet concrete in the compound curves the shells required, and no crane available at the time could have lifted a shell whole. The building would have to rise the way a rib cage rises, piece by piece, each piece slightly different from its neighbor, each piece carrying its portion of the load. The ribs themselves were an achievement of patient calculation. Because every shell was drawn from the same imagined sphere, the ribs could be cast using a limited number of standardized molds, adjusted incrementally to account for each rib's specific position along the shell's curve. This was, in its own way, a philosophy made concrete. The design accepted repetition as a form of economy and precision as a form of honesty, so that a limited set of tools could be made to produce an almost limitless variety of forms. Thousands of these precast segments were required across the full structure, and each one had to match its designated position with an accuracy that left almost no room for the ordinary imprecisions of construction. The tolerances demanded were closer to those of instrument making than to the tolerances usually associated with pouring concrete on a building site, and it was this demand for precision, more than any single design decision, that shaped the daily rhythm of the years that followed. The concrete itself was mixed and cast at a purpose-built yard near the site, where molds were adjusted rib by rib according to detailed calculations drawn from the shell's geometry. Steel reinforcement was set within each mold, with careful attention to the eventual stresses the rib would carry once raised into position, and the concrete was allowed to cure under controlled conditions before being transported the short distance to the harbor's edge. Even this short journey required care, for a hairline crack introduced in transport could compromise months of careful casting. Every segment arrived at its final position bearing a kind of quiet history already, having been measured, poured, cured, and inspected long before it ever reached the height at which it would finally take its place in the sky. Above the podium, cranes lifted each rib into position along temporary steel trusses that held the developing shells in their intended curve until enough segments had been joined for the structure to become self-supporting. This was, in effect, a scaffold within a scaffold, an invisible skeleton of steel supporting the visible skeleton of concrete until the concrete could finally support itself. Once the ribs of a given shell had all been set and joined, the temporary steelwork could be removed, and the shell would stand on its own, its ribs meeting at the ridge and spreading downward toward the podium in a fan of white concrete bones. It was a slow and exacting process, and one that offered little visual drama from a distance, since progress could often be measured only in a handful of new ribs raised across an entire working week. But from close by, on the scaffolds themselves, the labor carried its own particular intensity, for each lift required cranes, riggers, and structural engineers to coordinate with an accuracy that left almost nothing to improvisation. Once the ribs of the shells had been set, they required an outer skin, and it was here that the building found what would become its most recognizable and most misunderstood feature: the gleaming white and cream tiles that would come to stand in the minds of millions who never set foot near the harbor for the entire structure itself. The tiles chosen were manufactured in Sweden, produced by a company with long experience in high-fired ceramics, capable of withstanding sun, salt air, and decades of weather without losing their surface quality. They were a chevron-patterned tile, glazed to a soft sheen rather than a hard gloss, designed so that from a distance the shells would seem to shift subtly between white and a pale cream, depending on the angle of the light and the position of the sun. This was not decoration for its own sake. The chevron pattern and the slight variation between the two tones were chosen specifically so that the vast, smooth curves of the shells would not appear flat or uniformly reflective, but would instead carry a faint texture, almost like the scales of some enormous creature or the ridged surface of a shell drawn from the sea itself, an association the architect had always intended the building to carry. More than 1 million individual tiles were eventually required to cover the shells in their entirety, and each one had to be fixed with an accuracy that matched the precision already demanded of the ribs beneath them. The tiles were set into precast concrete panels off-site, in a controlled process that allowed for careful alignment of the chevron pattern before the panels themselves were lifted and fixed to the ribs. This indirect method, tiling the panels before they were raised rather than tiling the shells directly once they stood in place, allowed for a level of quality control that would have been almost impossible to achieve high above the harbor, where wind, salt spray, and the sheer difficulty of working at height would have made such delicate, patterned work far more perilous and far less exact. Even so, an enormous amount of work remained to be done at height once the tiled panels were fixed into position. Joints had to be sealed, alignments checked, damaged tiles replaced, and the overall curve of the shell verified against the drawings again and again as construction proceeded upward and outward. The men who carried out this work spent their days on scaffolds and temporary platforms suspended high above the podium, with the waters of the harbor visible far below them and the wind moving differently at that height than it ever did at ground level. Photographs from the period, of which a modest number survive in archives and newspaper collections, show men in flat caps and loose shirts standing on narrow boards, tools in hand, the white curve of a half-finished shell rising behind them like the flank of some enormous vessel still under construction. The work was steady rather than frantic, governed by careful procedure rather than urgency, but it carried with it the ordinary dangers of any construction site conducted at considerable height above hard ground and open water. Wages for the men on the scaffolds were, according to surviving records, broadly in line with other skilled construction work of the period in Sydney, supplemented in some cases by allowances for height work and the particular skills required to handle precast concrete and glazed ceramic panels without damaging either. Shifts began early, before the harbour traffic had fully woken, and the men would gather at the base of the site to collect tools and instructions before the day's lifting began. Lunch breaks were often taken on the scaffolds themselves rather than climbing down and back up again, a small daily compromise between comfort and efficiency that later accounts recall with a kind of wry, unremarkable fondness. There are no records of dramatic disaster during this phase of the work, though the ordinary risks of height, of crane operation, and of handling heavy precast panels in shifting harbour winds remained present every day, managed through procedure, caution, and the quiet, practiced competence of men who had, by this stage of the project, spent years learning to work with a building unlike any other attempted before it. What emerged from this slow accumulation of ribs and tiles, of casting yards and cranes, of careful joints checked and rechecked against the drawings, was a structure that from a distance appeared almost impossibly smooth and simple, a handful of vast white shells resting easily upon their podium, and yet which up close revealed itself to be an intricate lattice of thousands of individually cast and individually placed components, each one slightly different from the last, each one demanding its own portion of human patience before it could take its place in the whole. The building's famous surface, gleaming and pale above the water, carried within it the quiet record of every rib poured in the casting yard, every tile pressed into its panel, every worker who had stood on a narrow scaffold board with the harbour far below, fitting one more piece into a shape that had, at last, become buildable. The construction of the Sydney Opera House had, from its earliest planning, been divided into 3 great stages, and this division, sensible as it seemed on paper, would in practice become one of the quiet sources of the difficulties that followed. The first stage was the podium, the great platform of concrete that would rise from the harbour's edge and carry upon it the whole weight of what was to come. The second stage was the shell structure itself, the roof of sails that had taken so many years and so many discarded models to resolve into something buildable. The third stage was the interior fit-out, the halls and foyers and mechanical systems that would turn a sculptural exterior into a working theatre. Each stage depended on the one before it, and each stage, in the manner of large and ambitious projects, proved slower and costlier than the estimates that had first been offered to the public and to the Parliament that had approved them. The decision to begin construction on the podium before the design of the shells had been fully resolved was not, in itself, an act of carelessness. There had been real pressure, political and civic, to show visible progress on a project that had already captured the public imagination through competition and unveiling. The government of the day wished to see concrete rising from the site, and the architect, for his part, believed that the mathematics of the shells, though not yet solved, would eventually yield to patient work, as indeed it did with the discovery of the sphere. But the practical consequence of beginning the podium before the shell design was complete was that the platform, once built, did not perfectly suit the loads and geometries that the final shell solution would require. Sections of the podium had to be demolished and rebuilt once the ribbed pre-cast structure of the sails was settled upon, an expensive and visible reminder that staged construction, however politically convenient, carried its own quiet costs. Through the early 1960s, as the shell problem was being worked through by Utzon's office and by the engineers at Arup and Partners, the public record of the project's cost and schedule began to diverge sharply from what had first been promised. The original estimate, offered at the time of the competition and in the early stages of planning, had suggested a building that might be completed within a few years for a sum in the range of a few £1,000,000. By the middle of the decade, it had become clear to anyone reading the newspapers of Sydney that neither figure would hold. The costs were climbing, driven in part by the staged construction, in part by the sheer novelty of the engineering required, and in part by the ordinary difficulties of building anything of scale beside open water, where materials had to be brought in by barge and where every crane and hoist worked within sight of the harbour's shifting weather. The schedule too was slipping, and each new year brought fresh reports comparing what had been promised against what had actually been achieved. This was not, it should be said, an unusual pattern for a building of such ambition. Great structures throughout history had almost without exception cost more and taken longer than their first estimates suggested, a pattern the record shows repeating from cathedral to bridge to skyscraper. But in Sydney, the growing gap between promise and delivery became a matter of public and political concern in a way that few building projects experience, in part because the Opera House had been funded not through ordinary government revenue, but through a state lottery established specifically for the purpose, a scheme that made its costs unusually visible to the citizens who bought the tickets and watched the jackpot numbers hoping to see their money returned to them. The lottery had been a clever mechanism for funding an expensive civic project without direct taxation, but it also meant that every article about rising costs carried with it an implicit question about where the ticket buyer's money was actually going and how much more of it would be needed before the sails on the harbour were finished. Then, in 1965, the political ground beneath the project shifted. The state government of New South Wales, which had commissioned the competition and had stood, in the person of its premier, as one of the Opera House's most visible champions, was voted out of office, and a new government took its place. With this change came a new Minister for Public Works, a man named Davis Hughes, who would take on responsibility for overseeing the project on behalf of the state. Where the previous government had shown a willingness to accept the architect's judgment on matters of design, cost and schedule as the necessary price of an extraordinary building, the new minister brought with him a different temperament, one more inclined to demand strict accounting, firm deadlines, and clearer lines of authority over decisions that affected public money. This was not on its own an unreasonable position for a minister responsible to a parliament and to taxpayers, but it set in motion a relationship between architect and government that would grow steadily more strained as the months passed. The friction that developed between Utzon and Hughes centered on several intertwined issues, each documented in the correspondence and minutes that survive from this period. There were disagreements over cost estimates for stages of the work not yet begun, particularly the interiors, where Utzon's evolving designs for acoustic and structural details had not yet been reduced to fixed drawings and firm prices in the manner the government now demanded. There were disputes over payments, with the architect's office reporting that invoices for work already completed were going unpaid or delayed, creating cash flow difficulties for a private practice that depended on those payments to meet its own obligations to staff and consultants. And there were disagreements, perhaps the most consequential of all, over where the authority to make final decisions on design matters actually rested. Utzon held to the view, consistent with his understanding of the original commission, that as architect he retained design authority over the building's aesthetic and functional details, subject to reasonable oversight, but not to line-by-line direction from a government ministry. Hughes and his department, for their part, held to the view that as the responsible public authority accountable for the expenditure of lottery funds, the government retained the right to demand firm costings, approved drawings, and demonstrable progress before further payments would be released. The documented record from this period shows both sides pressing their positions through formal correspondence rather than through the kind of open confrontation that might make for a simpler story. Utzon wrote to the department requesting payment for work completed and raising concerns about the practicality of demands for detailed costings on design elements still in development. The department, through the minister's office, wrote back, requesting more detailed accounting and expressing concern about the pace of design resolution for the building's interiors, which remained, even as the shells neared structural completion, in a state of ongoing study rather than fixed specification. Neither side's letters, read now, show the tone of open hostility that later accounts of this period sometimes suggest. They show, instead, two parties operating from different institutional logics, one oriented toward the patient resolution of an unprecedented design problem, the other oriented toward the accountability structures expected of a large public expenditure. It is worth pausing here to note what the historical record does and does not support. It does not support a simple narrative of a visionary architect persecuted by a Philistine bureaucrat, though this version of events has often been told. Nor does it support a narrative of an irresponsible architect indulging endless redesign at public expense, though this version has also been told, particularly by critics of the project at the time. What the documented correspondence suggests, more modestly, is a genuine and difficult tension between the demands of an unprecedented design process, one that was still solving fundamental problems of geometry and construction well after ground had been broken, and the demands of public accountability for an increasingly expensive civic project, funded by ordinary citizens through a lottery. Both pressures were real, both were, in their own terms, reasonable, and the collision between them, unfolding letter by letter through the middle years of the 1960s, would not resolve gently. By this stage in the project's life, the podium stood largely complete, its concrete mass settled into the harbor's edge, patiently carrying the loads it had been built to carry, even as portions of it bore the scars of the earlier demolition and rebuilding made necessary by the shell's final geometry. The shells themselves were rising rib by rib in the sequence made possible by the sphere solution, each precast section lifted into place according to the patient logic that Arup's engineers had worked out. But above this visible progress, in the offices of government and architect alike, a quieter structure was cracking, one made not of concrete and steel, but of trust, authority, and the accumulated weight of unmet expectations on both sides. The sails continued to rise over the water, gleaming with the promise of what they would become, even as the relationship between the man who had first drawn them and the government that had commissioned them grew, month by month, harder to sustain. By 1966, the correspondence between Utzon's office and the New South Wales government had taken on a tone that no longer resembled collaboration. Letters that once discussed shell curvature and glazing systems now turned with increasing frequency to the language of accounts and authority, who had approved which drawing, whose signature carried weight, and whether the architect could be paid for work already completed. The dispute, when it is traced back through the surviving correspondence, appears to have begun modestly enough, in the ordinary friction of a large public project passing through the hands of a new government. The state election of 1965 had brought a change of administration, and with it, a change in temperament toward the building on Bennelong Point. The new Minister for Public Works, Davis Hughes, arrived in his post with a mandate to control costs that had already climbed far beyond the original estimate, and he found in Utzon's working method fluid, iterative, resistant to fixed schedules, a source of frustration rather than admiration. Where the previous government had tolerated, even encouraged, the architect's insistence on solving problems as they arose, the new one wanted fixed drawings, fixed budgets, and fixed dates. These were reasonable demands for an accountable public work. They were also, according to those who worked closest to Utzon, nearly impossible to reconcile with the nature of what he was still designing. The friction concentrated in the end on a single practical matter: payment. Utzon's office had submitted invoices for work completed on the interior structure and the mechanical systems, and the Department of Public Works, under Hughes's direction, withheld them, citing incomplete documentation. Utzon maintained that the drawings in question had been delivered in the same working format his office had used throughout the project, a format the department had accepted without objection for years. The department maintained that a new, more rigorous standard was required going forward, given the scale of unresolved costs on the project as a whole. Both positions, read now from a distance of decades, contain a kind of reasonableness that makes the rupture harder to place blame upon and easier to understand as the almost inevitable result of two working cultures. One bureaucratic, one artistic, brought into forced proximity for a decade without a shared vocabulary of trust. By the early weeks of 1966, Utzon's office in Sydney had gone unpaid for months, and the architect, whose personal finances had never been separated cleanly from the running costs of the project, found himself unable to meet his own office's wages. He wrote to Hughes directly, describing the situation not as a negotiating position, but as a simple fact. The office could not continue to operate without the funds already owed for work delivered. The minister's replies, preserved in the public record, offered no resolution, only a repetition of procedural requirements that Utzon regarded as a pretext rather than a genuine accounting concern. It is worth pausing, gently, on how ordinary this kind of dispute would seem on any other public commission. A disagreement over invoices, a change of government, a tightening of financial oversight. What made it extraordinary was the structure standing half-finished above the harbour, its shells nearing completion, its interior still entirely unresolved, and an architect whose authority over that interior was, in that moment, being quietly stripped away by men who controlled the money, but not, in any real sense, the vision. On the 28th of February 1966, Utzon wrote to the New South Wales government offering his resignation from the project. The letter, when read in full, contains none of the anger that a modern reader might expect from a man pushed to such a point. It is measured, almost weary, describing a situation that had become, in his words, impossible to continue under. He stated that he had been forced from the project rather than choosing to leave it, that the department's refusal to pay outstanding fees left him no practical means of maintaining his office or his authority over the design. He did not resign in protest exactly, though the effect was the same. He resigned because the structure of trust required to keep designing had already collapsed beneath him, quietly, over months, until there was nothing left to stand on. The government accepted the resignation with what many at the time considered surprising speed, appointing a panel of local architects, Peter Hall, Lionel Todd, David Littlemore, and the government architect Ted Farmer, to complete the project in his place. Beginning with the interior spaces, Utzon had not yet finalized. The public reaction when the news broke was immediate and, in its way, unusual for a dispute so procedural in its origins. Architects across Australia and internationally issued statements of protest, several resigning from advisory boards or refusing further association with the project in solidarity. A demonstration was held outside the New South Wales Parliament, drawing several hundred people, many of them architecture students and members of the profession, carrying placards that called for Utzon's reinstatement and accused the government of a betrayal not merely of one man, but of the building itself. Letters flooded the newspapers, some defending the government's fiscal position, many more expressing a kind of public grief that a project so identified with its architect's vision could proceed, apparently smoothly, without him. There is a photograph from the period, often reproduced since, showing a small crowd gathered with signs reading simply, "Bring back Utzon," the plainness of the request carrying more weight than any longer argument could have. The government, for its part, remained unmoved. Hughes gave interviews defending the decision as a matter of fiscal responsibility and project management, arguing that the building could and would be completed without further delay under local direction, and that Utzon's resignation, however regrettable, had been his own choice to make. There is little evidence in the record that the government seriously entertained reconciliation once the resignation was formally accepted. Whatever door might once have existed for a negotiated return closed quickly, and by the following month, the appointed panel of architects had already begun reviewing the unfinished interior designs, working from Utzon's models and drawings without further consultation with the man who had made them. Utzon left Australia not long after, departing with his family in April of 1966, and he would not set foot in the country again for the remainder of his long life. He returned, in later decades, to a kind of formal reconciliation from a distance. Honours conferred, statements of regret issued by governments that had long since changed hands, an eventual invitation extended to advise on renovations to the building's interior in his final years, which he accepted through his son, working from his home in Denmark, never travelling to see the results in person. He died in November of 2008, having never again looked upon the harbour where his shells stood finished, weathered, and by then beloved by the very public whose government had driven him away. Accounts differ, and always will, on whether this absence was a matter of principle, of hurt too deep to set aside, or simply the practical reality of an aging man whose health made long travel difficult in his final years. He gave few detailed public explanations, and the ones he did give were quiet, almost reluctant, consistent with a man who preferred to let the work speak rather than the wound. It is tempting, from the distance of half a century, to render this moment as a clean story of villainy and injustice, a government too small in its thinking to hold a vision too large for its budgets. The historical record resists so simple a shape. Hughes and his department were operating within real constraints, answering to a public that had watched costs climb year after year with no end clearly in sight, and their frustration, however costly its consequences, was not without cause. Utzon, for his part, working in a mode that resisted fixed schedules and finished drawings, had made himself vulnerable to exactly the kind of procedural pressure that ultimately removed him. Neither fact diminishes the loss. A building of extraordinary and unprecedented ambition lost in 1966, the one mind that had carried its full shape from the very beginning, the sails and the spaces beneath them held together in a single unbroken vision. What came after would still rise, would still stand, would still be finished according to plans that bore his signature at their root. But it would be finished, from that point forward, by other hands, working from what remained of his intentions rather than continuing to imagine alongside him. Somewhere beneath every account of budgets and drawings and departmental memoranda lies this simpler fact. A man had given a decade of his working life to a shape he alone had first imagined, and in the end, he was made to leave it standing without him, unfinished, on the far side of the world from where he would spend the rest of his days. In the months that followed Utzon's departure, the New South Wales government moved with the particular haste of an administration eager to demonstrate that the work would continue regardless of who had once stood at its centre. A new panel was assembled to take charge of the design and construction that remained, and at its head was placed a Sydney architect named Peter Hall, a younger man who had not asked for the commission and who, by his own later account, accepted it only after considerable hesitation. He understood, as anyone in the profession understood, what it meant to step into a project so thoroughly identified with another man's name. The shells alone would forever be read as Utzon's signature on the skyline, regardless of who completed the rooms beneath them. Hall was joined by structural engineers and by two other architects, Lionel Todd and David Littlemore, and together this reconstituted team was handed drawings that were, in many places, incomplete, schematic, or existing only as concepts Utzon had described in meetings rather than committed fully to paper. The interiors, the acoustics, the seating, the stage machinery, the very question of what would happen inside the shells once audiences arrived beneath them, all of this remained substantially unresolved, and it fell now to men who had not originated the vision to decide how it would be lived out in practice. The task before them was not simply technical. It was interpretive in the way that finishing another person's unfinished sentence is interpretive. Utzon had spoken before his departure of walls of plywood, of interiors that would continue the sense of sculpted organic form suggested by the shells outside, of an approach to materials that treated the building as a continuous idea rather than a shell wrapped around conventional rooms. Some of this thinking survived into what was eventually built, but much of it did not, or survived only in altered form, reshaped by the pressures of cost, of fire regulation, of stage engineering, and of the practical demands of opera and orchestral performance that had not been fully reconciled with the original design when Utzon left. The building's two largest halls, the ones the shells most visibly evoked, do not follow precisely the internal arrangement he had proposed. A major hall intended in early plans for opera was ultimately given over primarily to concert use, while opera itself was housed in a smaller theatre than had once been imagined, a rearrangement driven by acoustic advice and by a slow accumulation of technical judgments made after Utzon's involvement had ended. Whether the outcome served the city better or worse than his original conception would have done became, in the years that followed, a genuinely contested question, one without a settled answer, and it remains even now a subject on which engineers, architects, and musicians disagree. Acoustics, in particular, proved to be one of the most difficult inheritances Hall's team received. Utzon had worked closely, before his departure, with an acoustic consultant on the general principles that would govern how sound might move within the shells. But many of the specific decisions, the shaping of the ceiling above the main concert hall, the treatment of walls, the placement of reflective and absorptive surfaces, had not been finalized. The shells themselves, so triumphant an answer to the structural puzzle of the exterior, imposed real constraints on the interior spaces beneath them, since the shape of the roof did not automatically produce the volumes an acoustician would have chosen if designing a concert hall from empty ground. New consultants were brought in, and further changes were made to the ceiling and wall treatments of the main hall in the years after opening, as the building's actual acoustic performance became known through use. This was not incompetence on anyone's part. It was, rather, the ordinary condition of a building whose exterior had been conceived before its interior acoustics had been fully solved, and the burden of resolving that imbalance fell to the men who remained on site once the shape above them could no longer be altered. Through the later years of the 1960s, construction advanced with a slower, steadier rhythm than the sales themselves had once demanded. Concrete continued to be poured for interior structures. Plywood, chosen partly for its workability and partly for cost, was laminated and shaped for much of the paneling within the halls, an approach that departed from some of Utzon's original material intentions, but that answered, at least, to a version of the organic, curved sensibility he had championed. Stage machinery was designed and installed, adjusted repeatedly as the practical requirements of touring companies and resident orchestras became clearer. The glass walls that would eventually close the open ends of the shells, admitting daylight into the foyers and offering views out across the harbour, were designed and engineered during this period as well, a task complicated by the need to seal a structure whose form followed no conventional geometry and by the same French glass manufacturer, Boussois, that had helped resolve elements of the tiling years before. Progress was visible from the harbour and from the streets above it, the building rising level by level, hall by hall, in a way that suggested to anyone watching from outside that all was proceeding as it should. From within, however, those doing the work were acutely aware of how much they were guessing, adjusting, and deciding on their own, without the presence of the man whose imagination had set the entire undertaking in motion. The tension between honoring what Utzon had intended and doing what circumstances now required was rarely, by most accounts, a matter of open hostility among those who remained. Hall and his colleagues were not indifferent to the original vision. Several of them expressed in later interviews and written recollections a genuine respect for what Utzon had achieved and a discomfort with the position in which they had been placed. But respect and constraint do not always point in the same direction. Every decision about materials, every adjustment to a hall's dimensions, Every compromise made to satisfy a building code or a budget line carried with it an implicit judgment about how far the finished structure could still be called Utzon's building and how far it had become something else. A Sydney opera house built upon his foundation but shaped in its final details by other minds working under different pressures than the ones he had faced. Some choices were made because no better alternative existed within the money and time remaining. Others were made because the consultants brought in after 1966 held technical opinions that differed in specific and defensible ways from what had been proposed before. Neither explanation makes for a villain in the story, and few who have studied the record in later decades have found one. What emerges instead is the quieter, more difficult truth that finishing a building begun by a singular imagination, once that imagination is no longer present to arbitrate its own uncertainties, requires 100 small acts of interpretation, each of them reasonable in isolation, that together produce a result no one individual would have designed from nothing. By the early 1970s, the building had reached a stage where its essential character, for better or for difference, was largely settled. The shells stood complete, tiled and gleaming, already visible for years across the harbour as a fact of the skyline rather than a work in progress. The interiors beneath them, though still receiving finishing work, had taken on their final form. Halls of a certain size and orientation, ceilings and walls treated with acoustic materials chosen by consultants who had never spoken with Utzon about his intentions, foyers glazed with the harbour views he had always meant to preserve, stages equipped with machinery designed to serve companies and audiences who would arrive in numbers no one at the project's outset could have precisely forecast. It was, unmistakably, becoming Sydney Opera House. Whether it was becoming Utzon's Sydney Opera House in every particular was a question that would continue to be asked for decades afterward, weighed against the specific decisions that Hall's team had made and the specific reasons, technical and financial, that stood behind each one. For now, in those final years before completion, the building simply rose, Hall taking shape within shell, glass sealing what had once been open to the sky, the work carried forward not by the man who had first drawn its curves on paper, but by those who had inherited the task of finishing what he had begun and who did so, according to the record that survives, with as much care as the circumstances allowed them to give. By the time the last of the ribs was lifted into place above the harbour, the work had been going on for so long that few of the men still on site could remember the shells as anything other than a permanent feature of the sky above Bennelong Point. The topping out, when it came, was not marked by any great ceremony that the surviving records describe. There was no band, no gathering of dignitaries craning their necks upward to watch a final beam swung into position, no ribbon strung between cranes. What there was, according to the accounts left by the engineers and site foremen who were present, was a quieter kind of completion. One rib among the last 100 or so precast segments settling into its calculated position, checked against the geometry that over Arup's engineers had spent years refining, and pinned there to become at last a permanent part of the whole. The precast rib system itself, by the time it reached this final stage, represented one of the more remarkable achievements of the entire project, though it was rarely described that way at the time. Each shell was built from a series of precast concrete ribs, shaped and cast individually to conform to the geometry of the sphere that had been settled upon years before, the same sphere that had solved the impossible problem of the original freehand sails Jörn Utzon had first drawn without a formula behind them. The ribs varied in size depending on their position within each shell, tapering as they rose, each one manufactured to a tolerance that would have seemed extraordinary for a building project of any era, let alone one being carried out on a construction site perched over open water in the middle of the 20th century. They were cast on site in a purpose-built factory, cured, then lifted by a specially designed crane that traveled along rails atop the podium, hoisting each segment into position with a precision that the engineers had insisted upon from the earliest days of the redesign. Once in place, the ribs were joined by post-tensioned cables run through ducts cast into the concrete, cables that were then tensioned to draw the segments together into a single rigid structure, the individual ribs behaving once tensioned, not as separate pieces stacked one atop another, but as a continuous curved surface capable of carrying its own weight and resisting the loads the harbor environment would place upon it. The sight of the completed rib structure, standing free of its shell cladding for a brief period before the tiles were applied, was recorded in photographs that still circulate among those who study the building's history, and it shows something that later visitors to the finished opera house rarely appreciate. The shells, before their skin was applied, revealed as skeletal forms, ribbed and curved, resembling nothing so much as the exposed structure of some enormous vessel turned upside down, its bones visible against the sky before the smooth white surface that the world would come to recognize was laid over them. Workers who climbed among those ribs in the final stages of construction described in interviews given later in their lives a strange sensation of standing inside something that from a distance appeared solid and continuous, but which up close revealed itself as a lattice of individual decisions. Each rib a separate pore, a separate lift, a separate joint tensioned and checked. The whole held together not by mass alone, but by the calculated tension running through cables no wider than a man's wrist. Once the ribs were complete and tensioned, the tiling began in earnest, a process that had itself required years of separate research to solve. The search for a surface that would remain white under the harsh Australian sun without streaking, without absorbing salt from the harbour air, without shedding its finish under decades of weather, having occupied a great deal of Utzon's attention during the years he remained involved with the project. The tiles that were eventually chosen, produced by a Swedish manufacturer to Utzon's specifications, were arranged in a pattern of glossy and matte surfaces that gave the shells their particular texture, a texture that from a distance reads as a single continuous white, but which up close reveals itself as a careful arrangement of individual ceramic pieces. Over 1 million of them across the completed roof, each one selected and placed according to a system Utzon had developed specifically for this building and no other. The application of these tiles across the final shells, once the concrete ribs beneath them were complete, was itself a slow and exacting labor, workers moving across the curved surfaces on temporary platforms, setting tiles into a bed that had to conform to the same demanding geometry as the concrete beneath it. The work proceeding shell by shell, panel by panel, through the final years before the building's completion. With the shells complete and clad, the structure faced its first true tests against the conditions it had been built to withstand. Sydney Harbour is not a gentle environment for any structure exposed to open water, salt air, and the shifting winds that move across the harbour from the ocean beyond the heads, and the engineers who had designed the shell structure had known from the earliest stages of the redesign that wind loading would be one of the decisive factors in whatever solution they arrived at. The switch to the spherical geometry years earlier had allowed for calculations that simply could not have been performed with confidence on Utzon's original freehand shapes. And it was against this spherical geometry that the final structure was tested, first through models and calculations carried out over the preceding years, and then, as the shells neared completion, through direct observation of how the completed structure behaved under the winds that moved across the harbour on any given day. The shells, according to the engineering record, performed as calculated, the post-tensioned rib system distributing wind loads through the structure in the manner the models had predicted, the building settling into the kind of quiet structural confidence that comes only after years of calculation have been tested against the unpredictable behavior of real weather over real water. The salt air presented its own separate challenge, one that concerned not the structural integrity of the concrete ribs beneath the tiles, but the long-term durability of every exposed surface, every fitting, every piece of metal that would need to survive decades of exposure to a marine environment known for its corrosive effect on ordinary materials. The tiles themselves had been selected in part for their resistance to this environment, but beneath them, within the joints and fittings that held the structure together, engineers had specified materials and coatings intended to resist the slow creep of salt-laden air into every crevice of the building. Whether every one of these choices would prove adequate over the following decades was, at the time of completion, still an open question, one that only the passage of years could answer, and indeed, the building's later maintenance history would eventually reveal both the successes and the limitations of what had been chosen in those final years of construction. As the shells neared completion and the tiling work drew to a close, the scaffolding that had climbed alongside the structure for years began at last to come down. This process too unfolded without any particular ceremony, according to the records that survive, proceeding instead as a slow and careful unwinding of the temporary structures that had supported the work through its most demanding phase. Section by section, the scaffolding was dismantled. The cranes that had lifted so many thousands of precast ribs into position were removed from their rails atop the podium, and the shells, for the first time since their construction had begun, stood free, unsupported by anything but their own structure and the podium beneath them, visible from the harbour and from the city beyond in something close to their final form. Workers and engineers who had spent years accustomed to seeing the shells wrapped in scaffolding, obscured by the temporary structures necessary to their construction, described a particular quiet that settled over the site once that scaffolding was gone. The sails, as they had come to be called even before completion, standing exposed against the sky in a way that made visible, for the first time, the achievement that so many years of calculation and labor had been working toward. There is little in the surviving record to suggest that anyone connected with the project treated this moment as a triumph in any dramatic sense. The years that had led to this point had been marked by disputes over cost, disputes over authorship, the departure of the man who had first imagined the building's curved form, and the long, careful work of engineers and builders who had inherited a vision they had not created and had spent years translating it into something that could actually stand. What remained, once the scaffolding came down and the shells stood free above the harbour, was not celebration so much as a kind of quiet recognition among those who had lived through the project's most difficult years that something extraordinarily difficult had, against considerable odds, been achieved. The shells stood complete, tiled and tensioned, tested against wind and salt air, calculated and verified by engineers who had spent the better part of a decade solving problems that had no precedent in the history of concrete construction. And if there was pride among the workers and engineers who had brought the structure to this point, it was expressed in the accounts that survive, not through declaration, but through the simple fact of the work itself standing there, finished, above the water, exactly where it had been intended to stand from the very beginning. By the autumn of 1973, the building had become something the city had learned to live alongside without quite believing in its completion. For 18 years, since the competition had first been announced and the drawing had been pulled from the pile of discarded entries, the site on Benelong Point had been a place of scaffolding and cranes, of cost overruns argued in newspapers and Parliament, of engineering problems solved in drafting rooms long after the concrete had already been poured below. Now, in October, the scaffolding was gone. The cranes had been dismantled and taken away. What remained was the building itself, and a city preparing, with a mixture of relief and disbelief, to formally receive it. The date set for the opening was the 20th of October, a Saturday, and the ceremony was to be performed by Queen Elizabeth II, who had travelled to Sydney as part of a wider tour and who would, on that afternoon, stand before the building and declare it open in the name of the nation that had built it. The choice of a royal opening was, in the context of 1973 Australia, neither unusual nor without its own quiet significance. The country remained, in its constitutional arrangements, tied to the British Crown, and the presence of the monarch at the opening of what was already being described as the nation's most ambitious public building carried a weight that a lesser ceremony could not have carried. It placed the Opera House in the eyes of those watching from the harbour foreshores and from television sets across the country, within a lineage of formal state occasions, and it offered the government of New South Wales, whose premiers across nearly 2 decades had inherited both the building and its difficulties, an opportunity to present the finished structure as a triumph rather than as the long and difficult undertaking the record shows it to have been. The accounts that survive describe a harbour transformed for the occasion. Crowds gathered along the foreshores in numbers that estimates place in the hundreds of thousands, filling the parklands near the building itself and lining the shores of the wider harbour for a view of the ceremony and of the fireworks that would follow after dark. Vessels of every kind, according to the newspaper reports of the following days, filled the water before the building. Ferries carrying spectators who had paid for a harbour view of the event, small pleasure craft anchored in whatever space remained, naval vessels standing further out, their presence a formal acknowledgement of the occasion's significance to the state. The harbour, which for 18 years had watched the shells rise slowly above a shifting skyline of cranes and scaffolding, was, on this single afternoon, given over entirely to the building's completion, and the water itself became, in the photographs that survive, a kind of mirror for the structure it surrounded, the white-tiled shells catching the light of an early southern hemisphere spring afternoon and returning it across the surface of the bay. The ceremony itself was, by the standards of state occasions, brief. The Queen's address touched on the years of construction, on the ambition the building represented, and on the pride the completed structure might offer to the nation that had raised it. Though the text of her remarks, preserved in the archival record, treated the difficulties of the building's history with the diplomatic softness such occasions require, offering little acknowledgement of the disputes that had shaped the previous decade. Fireworks followed as evening fell, launched from barges positioned in the harbour and from the building's own forecourt, and the accounts of that night described the shells themselves as illuminated from below, their white surfaces catching colour from the display above, so that for the first time since the project's conception, the structure appeared not as a construction site nearing its end, but as the finished object its original drawings had promised. A building meant from its very first sketch to be seen from every angle of the harbour, now finally granted the chance to be seen that way, at night in full completion, before a crowd large enough to fill the shores on every side. What the ceremony did not include, and what the historical record notes with a gentleness that belies the difficulty of the fact, was the presence of the man whose original vision the building still bore in its shape and in its unmistakable silhouette, more than that of any other single person involved in its history. Utzon was not present at the opening of the Sydney Opera House. He had left Australia in 1966, following the disputes over cost, oversight, and creative control that had led to his resignation from the project, and in the 7 years between his departure and the building's completion, he had not returned to the country, nor had he been formally invited, in any manner the surviving correspondence suggests was seriously extended, to attend the ceremony marking the building's opening. His name was not mentioned in the Queen's address. The official programme for the day, according to accounts from those present, made only limited reference to his role in the building's design, a choice that reflected, more than any single decision by any single official, the unresolved and still unspoken tension between the government that had commissioned the building and the architect who had first imagined it. This absence is noted here without dwelling upon it, and without assigning blame in either direction beyond what the historical record itself supports, because the facts of the estrangement between Utzon and the project he had originated were already by 1973 a matter of public record, argued over in newspapers and government reports for years, and the ceremony's quiet omission of his presence was less a single act of exclusion than the final expression of a rupture that had begun 7 years earlier and had never, in the time since, been repaired. Alongside the ceremony, and inseparable from any honest account of the day, stood the matter of the building's cost, a figure that had shadowed the project since its earliest years, and that had, by the time of the opening, become as much a part of the Opera House's public story as the shells themselves. The original estimate, submitted at the time of the design competition in the mid-1950s, had placed the cost of construction at approximately $7 million Australian dollars, with a projected completion date of 1963. The building that opened in October of 1973 had, according to the figures most commonly cited in the historical and engineering literature, cost approximately 102 million Australian dollars, a sum arrived at across nearly 2 decades of revised engineering, redesigned interiors, changing government oversight, and the extraordinary technical difficulty of the shells themselves, whose final form and construction method had not even been settled at the time the original estimate was made. The disparity between these two figures, an increase, by most calculations, of more than 14 times the original projection, has often been presented in popular accounts as evidence of mismanagement or excess, And it is true that the funding structure adopted for the project, which relied significantly on a state lottery established specifically to finance the building's construction, reflected the government's own uncertainty about how such a cost might otherwise be met. But the documented history of the project also shows that the original estimate had been made before the building's true engineering challenges were understood, before the shell problem had been solved, before the interior planning had been fully resolved, and before the scope of the site works beneath the podium had been fully appreciated. The final cost, then, is best understood not simply as a failure of budgeting, but as the price of solving problems that, at the time the estimate was first written down, no engineer alive could have accurately priced, because no one yet knew how the shells would be built at all. In the days that followed the formal opening, the building began, for the first time in its history, to be used for the purpose it had always been intended to serve. Performances began within days of the ceremony, filling the concert hall and the opera theatre with audiences who had, in many cases, watched the building rise across the whole of their adult lives and who now sat within its finished halls for the first time. The accounts from that first week describe audiences arriving by ferry across the harbour in the evening light, the shells lit from below against the darkening sky, the forecourt filled with people moving toward the entrances in numbers the building's designers had planned for years earlier, but which the city itself had never quite seen gathered in one place before. Music filled the halls that had taken so many years and so much revision to complete, and the harbour, which had spent nearly 2 decades watching a construction site slowly resolve itself into a building, was, in those first performances, given something closer to what it had been promised from the very beginning. Not simply a structure standing above the water, but a place where the water and the city and the building itself might finally, after so long, come together. A building, once opened, does not stop becoming itself. It continues, season after season, to accumulate the small and large events that give a structure its meaning beyond the drawings that first imagined it, and in the years following that October opening, the Sydney Opera House began the long, unhurried process of turning from a celebrated feat of construction into something closer to a fixture of daily and national life. Orchestras rehearsed in its halls in the grey hours of the morning. School groups filed through its foyers on quiet weekday mornings, tour guides pointing upward at the shell ceilings and explaining, in simplified versions of a very complicated story, how the building had come to take its shape. Ferries angled past it on their harbour crossings, commuters glancing at it the way one glances at a familiar face, no longer struck by its improbability, but comforted by its constancy. It became, in this slow way, less a spectacle than a companion to the city, present in the background of 1,000 ordinary days, its shells catching the light of 1,000 ordinary sunsets, its podium steps climbed by generations of visitors who had not yet been born when the first stone was laid upon Bennelong Point. Yet even as the building settled into this rhythm of civic life, it carried within it a set of unresolved technical questions, chief among them the matter of sound. The concert hall, built within the shells that Utzon's successors had reworked according to their own engineering judgment, had been designed under considerable compromise. And from its earliest seasons, musicians and audiences alike noted its particular acoustic character, a hall that could feel, at times, less generous to the orchestra than the great concert halls of Europe that Sydney had long measured itself against. The shells themselves, so triumphant in their exterior form, had never been intended by Utzon to serve as the acoustic ceiling of the interior spaces at all. His original conception had called for a separate interior structure, a plywood ceiling system suspended within the shells to shape and carry sound according to careful acoustic design, much as the interior of a violin is shaped independently of the instrument's outer form. When the completion of the building passed to other hands, this interior system was altered, simplified, and in places abandoned under the pressures of time, cost, and differing engineering philosophy, and the resulting hall, though widely admired for its beauty, inherited acoustic limitations that would occupy conductors, technicians, and committees for decades to come. Modifications came in careful stages rather than in one dramatic overhaul. Adjustable acoustic rings were suspended above the stage in the years following opening. Great pale discs that could be raised or lowered to help direct sound back toward the musicians. and outward toward the audience. Reflective panels were added and refined. Seating was reconfigured. Engineers and acousticians returned again and again across the decades, testing frequencies, measuring reverberation times, listening, always listening, for the qualities that a concert hall of this stature was expected to possess. These efforts, patient and largely unseen by the audiences who filled the seats each evening, reflected a broader truth about the building as a whole, that its life after opening was not simply one of quiet enjoyment, but of continuous, careful tending, a slow correction and refinement of the compromises that had been made when the shells were finished under different hands than the one that had first drawn them. The theatres, too, were altered as the decades passed. The space originally intended for opera performances had, through the same late redesign that reshaped the interior of the shells, become in some ways less suited to the grand scale of opera than had once been hoped, and over the years that followed, the building's caretakers weighed how best to serve the many forms of performance the shells had been asked, almost accidentally, to house: opera, ballet, theatre, and concert music, all sharing spaces not originally divided along those lines in Utzon's earliest plans. Renovations addressed stage machinery, seating capacity, sightlines, and backstage facilities, each change made with the awareness that any alteration to so recognizable a building carried a weight beyond the merely practical. Every adjustment to the interior was undertaken in the shadow of the exterior's fame, a tension that would remain part of the building's ongoing story for as long as performances continued within it. Even as these technical and functional questions persisted, the Opera House's reputation in the wider world only grew. It appeared with increasing frequency in the visual shorthand used to represent Australia itself, a single silhouette standing in for an entire nation, in much the way certain towers stood in for Paris, or a particular bridge stood in for the harbour it crossed a shorter distance away. Photographs of the shells against sunrise, against fireworks, against the sails of yachts on the harbour below circulated in newspapers and later in the earliest currents of global television and, still later, across the internet, each image reinforcing the sense that this had become, whatever the disputes of its construction, one of the defining works of architecture of the 20th century. In 2007, this reputation received a formal and lasting recognition when the United Nations Educational, Scientific and Cultural Organization inscribed the Sydney Opera House on its World Heritage List, describing it as a masterpiece of 20th century architecture whose significance lay not only in its innovative structural design, but in its influence on architects and engineers throughout the world in the decades that followed. It was, at the time of its listing, a comparatively young building to receive such recognition, most World Heritage sites carrying the weight of centuries rather than mere decades, and the honour was understood, both within Australia and beyond it, as an acknowledgement that the building's importance had been established swiftly and had not required the passage of a great span of years to be recognised as genuine. Throughout these decades of growing recognition, the relationship between the Opera House and the man who had first imagined it remained distant and for many years unresolved. Utzon had left Australia in the early 1960s in circumstances that had been difficult for all involved, and for a long period afterward, contact between him and the institutions now responsible for the building he had begun was limited, coloured by the disputes of the past. But time, which had carried the building itself through so many changes, worked slowly on this estrangement as well. In the final decades of the 20th century and into the early years of the 21st, a gradual reconciliation began to take shape between Utzon and the Sydney Opera House Trust, the body now charged with the building's care. Correspondence resumed. Conversations, at first tentative, grew into something more substantial. In the late 1990s, Utzon was formally invited back into the life of the building he had designed, not as a returning resident, but as a guiding voice, consulted once more on matters of design as the Opera House Trust began to consider how future changes to the building might honour the architectural vision from which it had first sprung. Out of this renewed collaboration came one of the quieter but more significant documents in the building's later history, a set of design principles prepared by Utzon in collaboration with his son, the architect Jan Utzon, and issued in the early 2000s, intended to serve as a guide for any future work undertaken on the building. These principles addressed not only questions of material and form, but the underlying philosophy that had shaped the building from its earliest sketches, offering the trust a framework by which future renovations, additions, or repairs might be measured against the original architectural intent, even in the continued absence of the architect himself. It was, in its way, a form of authorship extended across distance and time, a way for Utzon to remain present in the ongoing life of the opera house without needing to stand once more upon Bennelong Point. For he never did return. Despite the reconciliation, despite the renewed correspondence and the formal role he came to hold once more in guiding the building's future, Utzon did not travel back to Sydney to see the completed shells in person. Not in the years immediately following opening, and not in the years of renewed collaboration that followed decades later. The reasons offered across the years varied and were never fully settled by any single account. Age, health, the difficulty of returning to a place that held both triumph and considerable pain, or perhaps simply a settled preference to let the building exist in his own mind as the vision he had drawn rather than the structure that had been finished by other hands. Whatever the private reasons, he continued from his home in Denmark to accept the honors that came to him because of the building, among them, in 2003, the Pritzker Prize, architecture's highest international recognition, whose jury cited the Sydney Opera House by name as a work that had become, in their words, one of the great iconic buildings of the 20th century, one that had become the symbol not only of a city but of an entire country. He accepted these honors from afar, corresponded with the trust that now cared for his building, and shaped, through the design principles he helped prepare, the terms by which future generations would be permitted to touch what he had first imagined. Present in every decision made about the shells, absent only in body from the harbour where they stood. In the decades that followed the completion of the building, a slower kind of construction began, one that involved no scaffolding and no concrete, only patient work in archives and record offices, in the private papers of engineers long retired, in the minutes of committees that had met and dissolved and been forgotten by all but the historians who came looking for them. This second building of the Sydney Opera House, the building of its true account, would take almost as long to raise as the shells themselves had taken, and it would prove, in its own way, just as contested. The popular story that had settled over the building in its early years was a simple one, and like most simple stories about complicated things, it left a great deal out. It held that Utzon had promised a building for a modest sum, that he had dawdled and revised and chased impossible shapes while the cost climbed without limit, and that his removal had been a regrettable but necessary correction, the moment when discipline was finally imposed upon a runaway dream. It was a story that suited those who had pushed him out, and it was a story that traveled easily, repeated in newspaper retrospectives and casual conversation long after the men who first told it had left public life. It was also, as the historians who later examined the record would show with some care, a story that did not survive contact with the documents. The financial history of the building, when it was finally traced in full, told something more complicated than a tale of one man's excess. The original estimate of £7 million, offered in the earliest and most tentative stage of the design, before the engineering of the roof had even been resolved, before Arup and his team had spent their first year wrestling with a geometry that did not yet exist in any formula, had never been a serious costing in the sense that a modern project would require. It was a figure produced to justify a competition and to reassure a public that the idea was affordable, offered at a moment when no one, including the judges who praised the design, could have said with confidence what it would take to build. The escalation from that number to the final cost, arriving near $102 million by the time the building opened, was driven by many forces working together, a design that changed in fundamental ways as the sphere solution replaced years of unbuildable geometry, a construction industry facing rising material and labor costs through a turbulent decade, a client that continued to add scope even as it complained of expense, and a political environment in which the building's cost became a convenient weapon regardless of who was actually responsible for it in any given year. Later reconstructions of the spending, drawn from the Public Works Department's own records and from the Opera House Trust's later reviews, showed clearly that a substantial share of the delay and expense attributed to Utzon in the popular telling had in fact accumulated after his departure, during the years when Peter Hall and the government architects were completing the interiors under specifications that themselves continued to shift. The building had not simply overrun because one architect refused to compromise. It had overrun because it was, from its first sketch, an attempt to build something for which no existing method of estimation could have been adequate, and because the political culture surrounding it was unwilling to say so plainly at the time. The timeline told a similar story once it was laid out year by year rather than compressed into a single narrative of failure. The stage that had consumed the most time, the resolution of the shell geometry into buildable form, had not been idle drift, but the necessary labor of solving a problem that had never been solved before. One that required Utzon and Arup's engineers to abandon dozens of proposed solutions before arriving at the sphere. Later engineering historians, reviewing the sequence of design iterations preserved in the project archive, would describe this period not as delay in any culpable sense, but as the ordinary, unavoidable cost of innovation at the edge of what materials and mathematics could then achieve. There was no shortcut through that work. It could only be done once, slowly, by people willing to discard what did not hold. It was this period, more than any other part of the building's history, that came to be regarded with the greatest respect by the engineers who studied it afterward. The sphere solution, in particular, was singled out again and again in the retrospectives that followed, described in structural engineering literature as one of the defining insights of 20th century architecture, a moment when a seemingly impossible sculptural ambition was reconciled with the plain requirements of buildable, repeatable, load-bearing form through an idea of striking simplicity once it had been found. Engineers who had spent careers on far less ambitious buildings spoke of the sphere solution the way mathematicians speak of an elegant proof, a case where the correct answer, once seen, seemed almost to have been inevitable, though reaching it had taken years of work that very nearly ended the project entirely. Professional bodies that had once distanced themselves from the controversy surrounding the build began, decades later, to hold up the Sydney shells as a teaching example, a case study in how architectural imagination and structural engineering could be made to serve one another rather than work at cross purposes, provided both sides were given the time the problem actually required. Alongside this engineering vindication came a slower, more personal one, arriving in fragments across many years before reaching its clearest expression in 2003, when the Pritzker Architecture Prize was awarded to Utzon, the profession's highest recognition, granted at last to a man who had spent 3 decades building almost nothing after leaving Sydney, his career elsewhere modest by comparison to the ambition he had shown in the one building the world would remember him for. The jury's citation named the Sydney Opera House directly, describing it as one of the great iconic buildings of the century, a structure that had become the symbol not only of its city, but of an entire nation. Language that would have seemed almost impossibly generous to those who had watched Utzon leave the country under a cloud of political recrimination less than 30 years before. He did not travel to Sydney to see the building again in the years that remained to him, work continuing instead through correspondence and through the design principles document he prepared with his son and with the trust, a set of guidelines meant to govern how future changes to the building would be considered, ensuring that his intentions for the shells and the interiors would survive any future renovation, even in his physical absence. It was, in its quiet way, as close to a reconciliation as the record would ever show. An old man in Denmark shaping, through careful written instruction, the terms by which a building on the far side of the world would continue to honor the vision he had first sketched on paper decades earlier. Not every question was resolved by this later reassessment, and the historians who did the work were generally careful to say so, rather than force a tidy conclusion onto a record that did not fully support one. The precise degree to which Utzon's own conduct, His reluctance at times to produce detailed working drawings on the schedule the government demanded contributed to the breakdown in trust between architect and client remained disputed, with some accounts emphasizing the government's unreasonable political pressure and others noting that Utzon's own working methods, unconventional and intensely personal, made the kind of collaborative oversight the project needed difficult to sustain. The full financial responsibility for particular phases of the overrun continued to be argued over by economic historians working from incomplete departmental records, some portions of which had been lost or never properly filed in the first place. And the question of what the building might have become had Utzon been permitted to complete the interiors himself, rather than Hall and his colleagues finishing them under different constraints, remained an open matter of speculation rather than settled history, since no one could say with certainty how Utzon's own unrealized plans, some of which survived only as unfinished sketches, would have translated into the finished spaces visitors now knew. What the archives did show clearly, when historians finally assembled them into something like a full account, was a project of such genuine difficulty that no single figure could reasonably bear the blame the popular story had assigned to one man alone, and a solution to that difficulty. The sphere and the shells it made possible, so elegant that its late recognition seemed, in hindsight, less like tardy justice than like a slow, deliberate correction. The historical record finally catching up to what the building itself had been telling anyone patient enough to look. Morning comes to the harbour the way it has come for thousands of mornings since the shells were finished, without ceremony, the light arriving first as a pale suggestion above the eastern headlands and then, gradually, as something firmer, catching the upper curves of the roof before it reaches the water below. The tiles that cover the shells, more than 1 million of them, laid in their chevron pattern of glossy white and soft matte cream, hold that early light differently than any other surface in the harbour, and for a few minutes each day, in the right season and the right weather, the building seems to generate its own illumination, as though the concrete beneath the ceramic skin had stored something of the sun from the day before and was only now, slowly, giving it back. Ferries cross in front of it. Gulls settle along its ridgelines. Tourists who have seen the building in 10,000 photographs stop, almost without exception, and simply look, and the pause they make is not the pause of recognition, but something closer to the pause old accounts describe visitors making at the foot of the great cathedrals, a small involuntary halt in the business of moving through the world, prompted by a shape too large and too particular to fit easily into the eye. The building endures now not as a curiosity or a controversy, but as infrastructure, in the plainest sense of that word, a place where several thousand people arrive each week to hear music or watch a performance or eat a meal with the harbour behind them, and where several thousand more simply pass on their way to somewhere else, the shells forming a backdrop so constant to the life of the city that long-time residents, by their own admission, sometimes stop truly seeing it at all. This is, in its way, the quietest form of vindication a building can receive, quieter than an award and more durable than a headline, the slow absorption of a once extraordinary structure into the ordinary rhythms of a place, so that it becomes not a monument to be visited but a fact of the landscape, as unremarkable in its daily presence as the headlands it sits between, and as essential. The engineering, too, has settled into its long middle age with a steadiness that would have surprised the doubters of 1957, when the shape existed only on paper, and no one could say with certainty that concrete would hold it. The ribs continue to carry their loads. The tiles continue to shed rain and glare in the pattern their maker intended. Reinforcement and roofing have been renewed in sections as decades of harbour weather have asked them to be, the building maintained rather than reinvented, its systems modernised so that audiences today enjoy acoustics and comforts the original design could not have anticipated, while the shells themselves, the argument the whole project was built to resolve, have needed remarkably little correction. A fact engineers who study the structure now regard as something close to remarkable. A validation of a solution reached in the end not by intuition or artistic instinct alone, but by geometry, patiently applied, until the math and the vision agreed. And it is here, standing before the finished building rather than the drawings that preceded it, that the deeper tension the whole undertaking revealed becomes easiest to see clearly, the tension between what a mind can imagine and what a hand or 1,000 hands working together can actually build. It is not a new tension. It is, in fact, one of the oldest in human history, present in every structure this channel has traced across the centuries, in the men who raised stone higher than stone had any right to go, and the men who spanned water no one believed could be spanned. But rarely has it been so starkly visible in a single project as it was in Sydney. Rarely has the gap between the sketch and the standing thing been so wide, or the cost of closing that gap so plainly written into a life. The building stands today as proof that the gap can be closed, that vision and practicality, so often described as opposites, are in truth two halves of the same difficult labor, neither sufficient without the other, the dreamer needing the engineer to make the dream stand up under its own weight, the engineer needing the dreamer to give the effort a shape worth all that trouble in the first place. What Sydney shows, more clearly perhaps than any other structure of its era, is that this partnership is not gentle. It asks a great deal of the people inside it. It asked, in this instance, nearly everything of one man, and something considerable of many others, before it produced a result that neither dreamer nor engineer working alone could have reached. 10,000 miles from the harbour, in a city built along quieter water, a drafting table stands in a room where an architect once worked late into countless evenings, the surface long since cleared of the drawings that passed across it, the room itself now more archive than workspace, kept by those who understood, eventually, what had been made there and wished some trace of the making to remain. There is a particular kind of stillness in a room like that, the stillness of tools set down and not picked up again, of a career's most consuming project finished by other hands in another country, while its author worked, by choice and necessity both, at this same table on smaller commissions, closer to home. It is tempting, and perhaps not wrong, to see something quietly moving in the fact that both places persist. The harbour where the vision was completed and the room where it was first drawn, half a world apart, each carrying its share of a story that neither alone could tell in full. Morning light falls into that drafting room the same way it falls onto the shells at the other end of the earth, without regard for the history it illuminates, simply arriving day after day on a desk and on a roofline that were never meant to be so far from each other and never quite stopped being close. The record now available to historians, thin in places and disputed in others, does not resolve every question the building raised, does not settle, finally and for all time, every argument about cost or credit or what might have happened had events in the winter of 1966 unfolded differently. It does something more useful than resolution. It restores proportion. It shows a competition won fairly by a design of real and demonstrable originality, a construction process burdened by problems few buildings of its age faced in combination, a partnership between architect and engineers that produced, under pressure, one of the notable structural solutions of the century, and a rupture that cost one man his authorship of the finished work and cost the building itself something harder to name, some portion of the coherence between vision and execution that only an unbroken partnership could have carried all the way to opening night. Both things are true. The shells stand, and they are magnificent, and they are also, in the most literal architectural sense, unfinished business, a vision carried to completion by other hands, imperfectly, faithfully, as well as those hands were able. This has always been the quiet subject running beneath every great structure this channel has followed, longer than any single bridge or tower or shell-roofed hall, the long human contest between what is imagined and what gravity and cost and time and the limits of a given age will actually permit to stand. Every structure in that long history has paid its own price for the crossing between the two, in money, in years, in the health, and sometimes the lives of the people who built it, and in the reputations of those who dreamed it first. Sydney paid its price differently than most, in the currency of one architect's peace, and the quiet decades he spent afterward at a distance from what he had made, and in the currency of every account since that has struggled to hold the achievement and the cost in the same steady hand. But the payment was made, as it always eventually is, and the building endures on the far side of it, tiled and curved and standing exactly where the competition brief once asked, however briefly, for something merely functional, and received instead a set of shells that argued, and are still arguing, that a harbour, a city, and an idea can sometimes ask for more than function and be given it, at a price no one fully anticipated by people who could not, in the end, walk away from what they had begun. The mist rises off the shells some mornings before the ferries start their crossings, thin and brief, burning away within the hour. And for those few minutes the building seems less a finished object than a shape still arriving, still settling into the harbour it was built to complete, the way it must have seemed to everyone who watched it rise, tile by tile, across those difficult years. It is a fitting way to leave it, standing in its early light, still becoming what it already unmistakably is. If you have found some quiet in this long look at Sydney's shells, there are other structures like it waiting on this channel, other spans and towers and difficult ground, other stories of dreamers and the engineers who held their visions up against the weather. You are welcome to find them whenever you are ready, and to rest a while longer here first.